Welcome to DivCasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
I'm Margaret Mitchell. I'm the Dean of the Divinity School and Professor of New Testament and Early Christian Literature. It's my real happiness to welcome you to the 2010 Alumnus of the Year lecture here at the University of Chicago Divinity School. We're here today for this event, and indeed the school itself is here today due to the foresight, vision, and accompanying financial generosity of the Baptist Theological Union. Formed at the inception of the university, the BTU has been, throughout the Divinity School's history, the centerpiece of its endowment, supporting faculty salaries and student scholarships, and providing funding for programs such as this occasion. The Divinity School is a bigger organic entity that goes far beyond current faculty and current students or the current dean. It's a living stream of people who wanted to understand religion better, and they thought that this university was the place to do it. University of Chicago alumni of the Divinity School are in ministry and in teaching and other positions throughout America and the world, thinking and talking about religion in intelligent, rigorous, critical, and engaged ways. Today we welcome back to campus and honor one of our eminent alumni. So on an annual basis, the school solicits nominations from alumni and alumni for appointment as alumnus or alumni of the year. Those nominations are then reviewed by the school's alumni council, which presents a nomination to the trustees of the BTU. The BTU reviews the council's nomination and selects a graduate whose career, in its judgment, reflects especially the positive values and characteristic aspirations of this institution. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Ted Peters, the Divinity School Alumnus of the Year for 2010. Professor Peters received his MA in 1970 and his PhD in 1973 from the Divinity School. He is Professor of Systematic Theology at Pacific Lutheran Seminary and the Graduate Theological Union. He is widely recognized as a leading voice in discussions between science and religion. He's a mediating, reasonable, and profound exponent of the task of Christian theology in the world, responsible to it, the world, and to the tradition, intellectually vibrant, and unafraid to tackle the hard, indeed the hardest, questions. Professor Peters is the author of 13 books. Many of them are on the table outside here, so on your way out you can have a look. Most recently, The Evolution of Terrestrial and Extraterrestrial Life. Where in the World is God? 2008. And he is the editor of at least 13 more books, or co-editor. Several of his books, such as the classic Playing God, Genetic Determinism and Human Freedom, are in multiple updated editions, as indeed you would expect, as he seeks to keep up with this fast-paced conversation about religion and science. His work has had a global impact, having been translated into many languages, including Korean, Chinese, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and Finnish. A prolific editor, he was editor and I think founding editor of Dialogue, a journal of theology from 1993 to 2007, editor for Science and Religion of the Ergebeverte Auflage, which is now appearing in English, Religion Past and Present, and he is currently co-editor of Theology and Science, a position he's held since the year 2000. The title of Professor Peters' Alumnus of the Year lecture is Can We Enhance the Imago Dei? A theological assessment of genetic alteration, pharmacological enhancement, nanotechnology, and transhumanism. Professor Peters, welcome back to Swift Hall.
Thank you, Dean Mitchell, and to the British Thermal Units, the Baptist Theological Union, for making the arrangements for me to visit an alma mater that I am genuinely proud of and appreciative of. And I get to see some old friends and some colleagues. It's a wonderful experience for me. So thanks for having me. I loved my 4 years here, 1968 to 1972. I had wanted the most rigorous of the doctoral programs as a student looking ahead, and I thought of the University of Chicago as sort of the Marines of theological doctoral programs, and so I got what I asked for. I'll have to tell you that. I was just, as you can imagine, old people remember things. I remember one day I was coming into Swift Hall and I noticed 3 black limousines pull up. And a number of people on the lawn fell down flat and went prostrate. And I came into the building. Frank Reynolds, who was our world religions professor, had 2 big bags of groceries. I said, "Can I help you, Frank?" "Yeah. Take these groceries into the kitchen with me. I got the Dalai Lama coming today." I said, "He just arrived." But getting back to the Marines of theology, I had loved the University of Chicago in advance because Paul Tillich had been here. And while I was here, we read Paul Tillich's Systematic Theology together. I think it might have been down in classroom 103, I'm not sure. But we would have David Tracy lecture on Monday, and Langdon Gilkey on Wednesday, and Schubert Ogden on Friday. And the second 2 always responded to the first, and then the next week we would reverse it. And the classroom was jammed. At any rate, that was exciting theology for a young person such as myself in those days. Well, as Dr. Mitchell said, over the years I've been focusing more and more in the area of theology and natural science. That keeps me in contact with friends here in Chicago, such as Phil Hefner and the Zygon Center, and John and Carol Albright, and others. And I'd like to deal with a topic in that area today on the question of whether or not we can, through technology, enhance the Imago Dei. So I'd like to start by teasing out for a little while some of the dimensions of the image of God in the human race and what's at stake there, and then turn to the question of these various forms of technology, genetics, and nanotechnology and the vision of the transhumanist, and asked what's going to happen, or what can we forecast will happen given what we understand theologically about human nature. So fasten your seatbelts. I come from Berkeley at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, which is part of the Graduate Theological Union. Jim, you've been there. And we try to put scientists and theologians together the way you put dice in a dice shaker. You shake them up and you roll them out and you just see what you get. We're not particularly ideologically driven, but we do think that a creative mutual interaction between these fields can be illuminating for both. Now, I'm going to start with talking about the Imago Dei and what is the function, the kind of social ontology of Imago Dei when we ascribe it to human beings. And for my analysis, I want to use these 2 categories. The first is archonic, and if you can think of the Greek word arche, which has two meanings. On the one hand, it means beginning, but on the other hand, it means governance. So archaeology is the study of beginnings, but a hierarchy tells you how things are governed. And it seems as though the human mind has a natural inclination to think that the way something begins establishes its essence, and then we have to respect its essence. Is the Imago Dei archonic or not? Epigenetic, even though that word is used a lot in the sciences today, I use it as it was coined by Jan Smuts in the 1920s, a biologist. For him, epigenesis means new things in biological evolution. Today we might call it emergence or something like that. My question, can bionanotech enhance the Imago Dei? We're going to try to analyze it according to these two ways of looking at the Imago Dei. Technogenesis, which puts together a variety of different ways of doing things to the human being that bring changes. We can speak of it as the coevolution of humanity and technology. As technology changes us, we change technology, and it becomes a kind of mutually influential circle. Right, the key passage on the Imago Dei is that Genesis 1:26 passage, where we human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. And the word tselem in particular in Hebrew has been massaged and remassaged by exegetes. What is the tselem that you and I as human beings participate in? We have a little bit of a debate going between Gerhard von Rott and the student Klaus Westermann, both Old Testament scholars. And one of the things I've noticed about German graduate students is that they have to disagree with their professor if they're going to graduate. So how can you disagree about the tselem? And the point that von Rott makes is that tselem fits together with dominion over the earth. The tselem is the image of the king, and you and I, sharing the image of the king, we similarly have dominion. Westermann disagrees that the word tselem is actually the word for a representative of the king. He thinks that it could refer to an idol. And then his second disagreement is smaller. It's the question, do you and I represent God in the creation as individuals, or does the human race do it collectively? Now, a couple more elements of trying to interpret this. Here in the Jewish Study Bible, we get dominion referring to what? Rule over the animal kingdom. So you and I as human beings are kings, and those who are servants are the animals. And then when we take a look at Psalm 8, which is also very important in this discussion, you and I as human beings are a little bit lower than the Elohim. Well, what does that mean? Just a little bit lower. Are we godlike or are we creaturely-like? And so we see a tension developing here. Let me go back. Okay, help me, Bill. I want to go back to the Jewish Study Bible. There we go. We see a little tension developing here then between you and I as the image of God and God proper. What if they get confused? Now in Berkeley, I've got two students who are currently writing dissertations on the relationship between the Imago Dei and animals. Now, they disagree, which is kind of fun. They disagree. Joshua, his t-shirt says, my ancestors spent 3.8 billion years evolving out of a primordial ooze, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. Joshua argues that theologians have futilely been pursuing an understanding of the Imago Dei by looking for certain traits or certain qualities that we have that make us superior to the animals. We have rational thought, we have language, we have opposable thumbs, we walk erect, and you can list a lot of these tries, and he calls that the homo singularis. What is there about the human being that makes us singular or unique vis-a-vis the animals, and is that what warrants our being kings and having dominion? That's his question. My other student, his name is Oliver. Oliver says, yeah, that's right. And the trait that we humans have that make us the Imago Dei and distinguish us in creation is self-reference. We can look in a mirror and we can recognize that it's me there. We can self-objectify. Well, then he goes on to note that we're not the only animal that can do that. Chimpanzees can do that. Some others can do that. So what Oliver wants to do is spread the Imago Dei to include all the animals that can do that. So in Oliver's church, we'll be baptizing chimpanzees at some point. Now, let's get back to Joshua. Joshua says no. That the only thing that gives the human race its status of the Imago Dei is the election of God. Now you can tell that he likes Reformed theology. John Calvin, Karl Barth. You can't find a distinguishable quality within us that so separates us from the animal world that we deserve to have the Imago Dei and deny it to them. It's only due to the election of God, and not only that, God has elected us to have certain responsibilities towards the creation. Now, I'm not going to take sides here, but what I want to do is say, boy, we're trying to figure out what the Imago Dei is. It's not exactly a simple thing. The two recent popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, are clearly archonic thinkers. That is to say, what is the essence of a human being? Their answer is the infusion of a soul into our body. When John Paul II issued an elocution on evolution in 1996, he said, "Thank you, Charles Darwin. Your theory of evolution explains the development of the human race up to a certain point, and then God imparts the spiritual soul. Similarly, when it comes to you and me individually, when the egg is fertilized by the sperm at conception, there's a third party. God imparts a spiritual soul, and it's the spiritual soul present in the conceptus which warrants treating it with dignity." So in both cases, evolution of the human race and you and me individually, we go back to the beginning, go back to the origin in order to locate the essence of what gives us the Imago Dei and dignity. One of the byproducts of dignity for all of us is equality. Here I'm citing Dwight Hopkins. If all of us have dignity, especially the way Pope John Paul II described it, and we don't treat everyone equally, that's a violation of our ontology. It's a violation of who we are sharing in the image of God. When we turn to the New Testament, it gets a little more complicated because now Jesus Christ is described as the image of God, the icon tu theou. I just want you to pay attention to that word icon there for a moment. So I want to ask, is this archonic or epigenetic? If Adam and Eve or the presence of the spiritual soul determine your and my Imago Dei at the beginning, then is Jesus just an add-on? Karl Barth would argue, let's go backwards. You start with Christ. Christ is the icon tou theou, the image of God in us. And Adam and Eve are only precursors. He wrote a book called Christ and Adam, interpreting the book of Romans, chapter 5, in terms of making this point. So, would it be fair to say that we're starting epigenetically with a historical figure instead of going back to the beginning? Now I want to do a little interlude. Remember, back in the Jewish Study Bible citation having to do with Psalm 8, we've got this little problem about the image supplanting that it is an image of. And the Bible was written before Descartes, before we took a nice cleaver to the subject-object relationship that we have to deal with in the modern world. And here's an icon, and I had an experience once. I left the University of Chicago, but I really didn't know everything. I thought I did. And I was listening to a lecture by Nikos Nisiotis, who was a philosopher from the University of Athens. And he was talking about the theology of icons. And I said, one of the problems, Dr. Nisiotis, that I have with icons is that they've been the same for 2,000 years. They don't change, they're flat. And in the West, we developed a realism, we developed drama, and you don't really see a history of art like that in Eastern iconography. And his face was getting red. I imagined smoke coming out of his ears. And he said, Dr. Peters, it's not art. Icons are not art. Art is a Western idea. No, icons are windows to the transcendent. And that's why there's a religious ritual that accompanies the making of an icon, the treatment of the icon, etc. So what Nisiotis is saying about iconography in the East is they're trying to maintain that double valence between it being a physical object on the one hand, but the co-presence of the transcendent on the other. That helps inform what we could mean by the Imago Dei for the human, and that tension that if the icon becomes the object itself, it becomes an idol. Luther, in one of his moments of subjectivity, says the trust and faith of the heart alone makes both God and idol. It's how you and I behave. It's not objectively what it is that we're referencing, but it's how we behave that determines whether or not we turn an icon into an idol. Just thinking a little bit about Jean Guérimard. The idol depends on the gaze that it satisfies you in my relationship. The idol consigns the divine to the measure of a human gaze, that propensity that we have to make God in our image rather than the other way around. The icon makes visible only by giving rise to an infinite gaze, that which transcends it. And then I like this little remark. The formula that St. Paul applies to Christ, icon tou theou tou eroratou, the icon of the invisible God must serve as our norm. So the visible opens us to the invisible, which lies beyond it. Now let me pursue my question a little bit more. Is there an epigenetic way to think about the image of God in us? Not everyone is an archonic thinker. Both Aristotle and Confucius had ways of celebrating what a human being is after we're educated. The spoudeos for Aristotle, or the educated person for Confucius. And in the modern world, that creates a little bit of tension because we want to affirm that human dignity is innate, It's innate, regardless of how much education we get. Yet, there is something in the anthropologies of these two philosophers that says, wait until you get educated and gain wisdom and a sense of social responsibility. Do we have anything like that in the New Testament? Well, what about fruits of the Spirit? St. Paul says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These fruits of the Spirit are things that St. Paul would like us to gain in time, over time. So we have a doctrine of sanctification. I would share, but I'm not there yet developmentally. Christian perfection for the Methodists. Theosis for the Easterners. In Wolfhard Pannenberg's anthropology, there's something intrinsic about the human nature that makes us open to the future. We're not done yet. What makes a human being is not what we were when we were born or when the human race first appeared in the evolutionary history, but it's our destiny. Yet, we're still like in the oven, and the cook isn't ready to pull us out yet. Phil Hefner wants to build that right into one of the human traits. We are the created co-creator. Created by God, we didn't put ourselves here. Heidegger was right. We find ourselves thrown into existence. But what kind of persons are we? We are created. And that creative possibility that is ours is a gift from God, and it's our responsibility. It's not just an ontology, it's really an exhortation to be created. So what I'm saying is, here we've got some anthropologies that are emphasizing that the future will be different from the past. The essence of what makes a human being is something that is still unfolding and developing. So let me just summarize where we have been. When we think archonically, we have to think about the dominion bequeathed to us in the Bible. Genesis is really an archonic book, for the most part. This has become translated in the modern world as human dignity. We have a moral right to be protected. Equality, we don't make some people more the image of God and other people less. And finally, there is a relationship with God that, in a sense, we are representing the beyond here on earth. But there's some epigenetic qualities too. As human beings, we're open to the future. We can think ourselves as gifted and mandated to be creative. We've got sanctification and theosis, that tomorrow we're going to get better than we were in the past. And finally, it's Christ-likeness, that rather than Adam or Eve-likeness, that defines who we are. Well, I'm thinking here, if we look at the epigenetic side of the ledger, we can ask ourselves, can bio-nanotech get us there? So that, I'm done with the first half now. I'd like to turn to the question as to whether or not the improvements in the human being that are projected for the next generation will actually get us there. Well, I want to distinguish some terms that are probably familiar. At least for ethicists, therapy means healing of pathology to restore health. Nobody thinks that that is immoral, that I know of. But now we start getting a little dicey with the concept of enhancement. Can we improve beyond the previous norm what a human being is? To enhance a human being makes a human being better than healthy. And in addition to that, we could enhance the whole human race through genetic and other technologies and make our future children better than we are. Then we have an ideology that I want to look at briefly, transhumanism. that really wants to use various forms of technology to make a better human being. More than that, a species that will be more highly evolved than us, and we'll simply slip back into a forgotten chapter in evolutionary history. Genetic enhancement, already we have to deal with this, and what we mean by it is using genetic knowledge and technology to bring about improvements in the capacities of living persons or future generations. For the most part, genetic technology can affect future generations easier than it can affect you and me. We can certainly select genes that we like and discard genes that we don't like in vitro fertilization. And the idea of splicing in genes that we want, if they're not already there, is pretty close technologically. So that if you want to have a super child, you want to have a child with a high IQ or high batting average or an ability to play the piano, you could manipulate the genes in the petri dish before it's implanted in the mother's womb. And one can imagine how, if these traits get passed on from generation to generation, that we could affect the evolutionary future of the whole human race. This is the definition that comes from the President's Council on Bioethics. That was during the George Bush era, headed by a University of Chicago professor. One of the things about genes is that to make them work the way you want to, you have to turn them on and turn them off. And that's where pharmacology comes in. If you're a genetics researcher, a molecular biologist, you don't want to just find a gene for a given trait. You want to find the switch that turns it on and off and come up with a drug so that you can control it. So there will be a constant, there already is, a constant relationship between genomic research on the one hand and the manufacture of new drugs on the other. Everybody is going to be happy if we get drugs that are therapeutic in character, but what happens if they have enhancement value? Well, what happens according to this cartoon is that somebody's going to make a lot of money. That's what's going to happen. I'm a baseball fan, and there was a time in my innocence in which I could yell so loud when Mark McGwire got up to bat that I couldn't lecture the next day in class. And that was in the days when Mark was in Oakland A's. And as you probably know, he was the first one to break Babe Ruth's home run record, but that was when he was playing for the St. Louis Cardinals. Look at little Mark that we had playing for the A's and big Mark for the Cardinals. Now, how did he do that? Well, according to Jose Canseco's book, Juiced, they would be poking each other with needles just before the baseball game would begin with anabolic steroids. And so little Mark couldn't do it, but big Mark could. So a big topic in athletics is whether or not you can use drugs in order to enhance your ability to play baseball. Now, I happen to be rooting right now for the San Francisco Giants to beat the Texas Rangers, and I am so happy that Barry Bonds is no longer on the team because it would hate me in a position to have to root for him. The way the ethicists handle it, it's not cheating if everybody does it, is not so much the question about whether or not a given individual gets enhanced, but in a competitive arena, when some can afford to get enhanced and others can't, it appears to be unfair. And we have not seen the last yet of drug enhancements for athletes. Now I'm going to turn a little bit to nanotechnology, which around the world currently draws more funds for research than any other single area of science. And nanotechnology deals with things that are very small. The word nano means dwarf, and if you want to measure things with your yardstick, a nanometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. That's 10 hydrogen atoms side by side. As you probably know, hydrogen atoms are the smallest of the atoms. So you're looking at things really small. The University of California in Berkeley there, they have an electronic microscope that right now sees down to 25 nanometers. So that means when you're looking at a cell, you just go right on down to these very primitive physical structures. Now, can we manipulate nanometers? Nanoparticles. Well, that's what a lot of research is attempting to do. And the first nano philosophers said, wouldn't it be great to create this little machine out of nanoparticles? We call it a vacuum cleaner. And we put it in your arteries and it'd run through your arteries, cleaning up all the cholesterol. So the imagination on the part of nanotech people is unlimited in this subject matter. And one of the topics that I see them talking about or hear them talking about so often when I'm with the nanotech people are to put small nanotech gadgets surgically in your and my brains. And these gadgets would have the Encyclopedia Britannica, or probably Wikipedia, in it, so that you could access this knowledge very quickly. And I think the first thing they're going to put in there, of course, will be all of David Tracy's books. The sentences cut in halves and thirds. So you can immediately think, and then you can find out what Dr. Tracy has to say. One step further, not just information access, but what about amplification of intelligence? Could we do that? And what's interesting is when talking with these people is the problems they foresee. Well, of course you'd want your encyclopedia updated, right? Dr. Tracy publishes a new book, you want it pumped in, well, you're going to have that done electronically, and somebody's going to be beaming the signal into your brain in order to keep your brain enhancer up to date. But they can also track your whereabouts. They can also put disinformation in there. You know, they can make you vote Republican. At any rate, but what's important is now, as we get to the transhumanists, is the idea that maybe through this combination of genetic manipulation, nanotechnology, and clever inventions, that we could redesign the human condition and get beyond the limits of what? The inevitability of aging, limitations on human and artificial intellects, unchosen psychology, suffering, and finally our confinement to planet Earth. That human intelligence would expand beyond the planet, fill the solar system, and go beyond. Big assumption right here. I want to flag intelligence. These people love intelligence. Very important in the history of the Imago Dei, because what is one of the traits that we like to think that the human race has that is in continuity with God and distinguishes us from the animals? That's rationality. The early scientists in the West all thought that mathematics is the language of nature, and if you and I learn the language of nature, we are simultaneously learning the thoughts of God. So the idea that rationality is the key ingredient in making the human being special comes out in spades when we're dealing with the transhumanists. Here's a combination, it's an eclectic combination of nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, cognitive science, artificial intelligence, that's robots, and then inverted intelligence amplification, that's making your and my brain smarter, and capitalism. Where did capitalism come from? And I've kind of looked for a real causal relationship, and it appears that this is going to be expensive, and the only people who can afford to pay for it are rich. Ray Kurzweil is a prophet looking forward to the singularity. I find his choice of words interesting, but what he means by this is that the next thing that will happen is that computers will become intelligent. Think that's going to happen, Bill?
No.
No, okay. I asked my brother that one time. Rob, who worked a lot on computers, do you think computers will become intelligent? He says, no. He says, computers only do what we tell them to do, and a lot of times they don't even do that. But Kurzweil says computers will become intelligent, and when they become intelligent, they'll gain the capacity to self-replicate. They eventually will increase their own intelligence, and this intelligence will go way beyond where you and I as human beings are. And that by about the year 2045, this whole new emergent species is going to take over. And the doctrine of evolution is very much a part of this framework. You and I are a transient species. We will slip into the past, and this post-human species with enhanced intelligence will take our place. The purpose of the universe reflects the same purpose as our lives, to move toward greater intelligence and knowledge. So ponder that for a minute. Is that the purpose of the universe? Is that the purpose of your and my life? Well, at the University of Chicago, it probably is. But ponder it. We human beings are very complex, and can we really reduce ourselves to this? We will, within this century, be ready to infuse our solar system with intelligence through self-replicating, non-biological intelligence. It will then spread out to the rest of the universe. So it starts here on Earth, it transcends our biological inheritance, and then the universe itself will become eventually intelligent. Oh, I know, humans didn't invent us at all. We evolved from plastic wires and little micro fingers. Actually, that's part of the intelligent design argument, but I thought it fit. Let's talk about death. This is the body of Lady Doddridge, who died in 1614, buried in Exeter Cathedral in England. Let's ask the question, is death an inescapable part of our finitude, or could we rethink of death as a disease that could be cured? The transhumanists don't like theologians. And the reason is that theologians, like priests, want to show up at funerals and give everybody kind words when they're grieving. And so they want to keep death because death is good for the church's business. But suppose we define death as not a part of human finitude, but it is instead a disease, and we're going to cure it. Then what? Well, if we could, through nanobiotech, keep those organs functioning and stop them from aging, we could live for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and if you don't get run over by a bus, you just go on and on. Radical life extension. They're going to defeat aging. They're going to extend human life indefinitely, perhaps for millennia. Simon Young says, oops. Simon Young says, death is a disease just waiting to be cured. There's a good chance aging can be entirely defeated within the next few decades. Just a distinction between life expectancy as a term for the average amount of time that average humans live. Lifespan would be the maximum amount of time that you and I might live. It's the lifespan that they're after. Now, there's a second version of this called cybernetic immortality. Back to Ray Kurzweil. It's a widespread assumption in these circles that human intelligence is inextricably linked to the brain. It consists of information patterns. Computers can handle information patterns. When we get a computer powerful enough, we could copy the information pattern in each one of our brains and then move it into a computer. If we think of the human body as the hardware and our mind as the software, we can simply move what it takes for you and me to have a mind into new hardware. And there you and I would be. And as long as somebody keeps backing up the program, we can live forever in the world of intelligence supported by computers. Interesting concept, but note how the reliance here on the concept of rationality and intelligence, that's what makes a human being, so that's the part of us that's going to become immortal. Uploading the human brain means scanning all of its salient details and then reinstantiating those details into a suitably powerful computational substrate. This process would capture a person's entire personality, memory, skills, and history. Well, let's think about this for a little bit. What's going on? I would like to suggest that we've got some not necessarily coherent, but rather competing assumptions at work in this line of thinking. One is that your and my mind is totally a product of brain function. And therefore, if we can deal with the brain, then we're going to get the mind as well. Here's a couple of examples of people who think this way. The mind and the brain are essentially two ways of looking at the same thing. A question that I would ask methodologically, is this a reductionist position? Secondly, why intelligence? Again, with all the things that you and I are, why intelligence? Okay, third, a second closely related concept is that the mind is software and the brain is hardware, so that you can remove the mind from the brain. The mind is thought to be an information pattern. We can upload our minds into computers, we can discard the body and attain cybernetic immortality. Could this be a modern form of dualism? It's not exactly Descartes' dualism, but it's getting kind of close. Finally, the third in my group is the mind is relational. The mind isn't just software sitting in hardware. The mind isn't just reducible to the brain, but your and my intelligence, even though it looks individual, it's actually an interactive kind of thing. Noreen Hertzfeld, one of my former students, says, and she's a computer science professor, if we accept the Turing test, do you know about the Turing test? Turing test, you want to know whether a computer is intelligent or not. Talk to it. If it's intelligent, you'll see. Up until this point, it hasn't happened. Okay, if we accept the Turing test as the ultimate arbiter of intelligence, then we have defined intelligence relational. We are not simply disembodied reasoning machines, says Greg Peterson, but persons in bodily and communal context. There's a monkey researcher in the UCLA Medical School named Leslie Brothers. And she was dealing with questions about where certain emotions map on the brain. And in order to even conduct their experiments with primates, they had to interact with each other. If you're going to study one brain, you can't just go to a monkey and say, you know, think about fear or something like that. They have to do it interactively. And her discovery was sort of her assumption, namely, their intelligence is interacting with character. It's not strictly individual in character. So in some ways, we need to make up our mind what the mind is. Okay, Transhumanist Manifesto. It's a humanism, it's not religious, at least ostensibly. As humanism freed us from the chains of superstition. Note the doctrine of progress there. Let transhumanism free us from our biological chains. Biofatalism will increasingly be replaced by techno-can-doism, the belief in the power of the new technology to free us from the limitations of our bodies and minds. In the 21st century, the belief in the fall of man will be replaced by the belief in his inevitable transcendence through superbiology. Let us cast aside cowardice and seize the torch of Prometheus with both hands. These are people who have a very positive view of the future. Okay, my doctor father is David Tracy, and going back to one of his earlier books, I would think David might say, we got a threat here that technology might be dehumanizing in character. Referring to something else, David writes, Techne becomes the product of the will to domination. Okay. Are we created in God's image to dominate? Should we be doing that? The product of the will to domination, power, and control, a power on its own, leveling all culture. We've seen how science and technology does that. Annihilating all at-homeness in the cosmos, uprooting all other questions in favor of those questions under the control of technology. Producing a planetary thought world where instrumental reason and illo will pass as thought. The object cannot think. The subject will not. We began as technical agents of our willful destiny. We seem to end as technicized spectators at our own execution. If I read this side by side with the transhumanists would be saying, yay! And David would be saying, nay. Inherent here is the doctrine of progress. I have to back up a little bit. One of the fatal flaws in the doctrine of progress that most theologians want to point out is that it usually includes a utopianism. A utopianism that says, we're going to fix everything. And I suspect that it's time for the theologians to draw that one out here. On the question of whether or not it's a good idea to connect progress with evolution, the first thing to note is that Darwin himself was ambiguous about it. On the one hand, he said no. On the other hand, he did say man in the distant future will be a far more perfect creature than he now is. If you ask a contemporary evolutionary biologist, is there progress in biological evolution? Most of them, not all of them, are going to say no. Two recent ones, Stephen Jay Gould, Francisco Ayala, who's still alive, will say no, there is no global progress. And to believe in progress and evolution is to take our experience with science and technology and superimpose it on biology where it doesn't belong. Okay, theologians like Sid. Well, I like Sid. Maybe not all theologians do. The human race as we know it frequently engages in poor judgment. Graffiti. Actually, I wanted to think about the computer virus. Computers were just wonderful things 20 years ago. And somebody invented a computer virus. And what is the value of that? One and only one value. It destroys. It was created for the purpose of destruction and nothing else. Will we, in the future, come up with a technology that nobody can undermine with the same motive as graffiti and computer viruses? Totalitarianism, as I mentioned already, the nanotech people are thinking about ways in which new brain technologies could become tools for totalitarianism. And then genocide. We did see in the 20th century how the advances in industrial achievement became used for mass murder. Now, is human nature in the new birth of the transhumanist era going to change in this respect? Martin Luther, I don't know if you want to consider him an optimist or pessimist, but to his observation, original sin really means that human nature is completely fallen. The intellect has become darkened. Sins have taken such a deep root in our being that in this life it cannot be entirely eradicated. And the transhumanists will say, oh yes, they can. You give us enough technology, we're going to eradicate it. Reinhold Niebuhr, as all the neo-Orthodox theologians would say, advances in science and technology, as great as they are, increase the capacity of the human race to do more destruction. That human history is ambiguous and is going to stay ambiguous for the foreseeable future. Langdon Gilkey, with whom I studied, and Langdon loved to present himself as the extension of both Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, made this point repeatedly. Morals do not advance in history, so even if the transhumanists are able to accomplish what they're hoping for, that doesn't mean that they will lift us to a higher moral plane than where we had been in the past. Hence, a progress of technology may in fact augur a regress in social harmony and social justice. Instead of saving mankind, can threaten to become the demonic instrument of mankind's destruction. This permanent ambiguity, no permanent, okay? We're stuck with it. This permanent ambiguity of historical process, this continuation of sin, even in an advancing culture, means that if there be a kingdom, it could not be realized through a socio-historical development leading to a perfect society in history. Oh, those naysayers. Hay says of this, when you've got a minute, I'd like to discuss this progress before. Okay, just to kind of sum up where we are, the transhumanists, in the words of Simon Young, want to replace Darwinian evolution. Remember, Darwinian evolution plus the doctrine of progress provide the framework within which this thinking takes place. From slavery to the selfish genes, that's a reference to the sociobiologists, to conscious self-rule by the human mind. Okay, so we're going to gain dominion over our genes. I formulate this as the eschatological problem. How do we get there from here? If the genes made us who we are, how are we going to remake the genes into something more than they are? Or the rhetorical question, can a leopard change its spots? As a theologian, I want to say there are two ways of looking at the future, actually borrowed from Jürgen Moltmann here. What those who want to design a future are assuming is that the future is futurum, a form of planning now and making the future the way we want to control it. A second vision of the future is Adventus, where the future comes to us with surprises and upsets our plans. Both of these notions of the future are scriptural, but the second one is being ignored in this particular topic, in this particular subject area. Religion tends to be archonic, to be sure, going back to beginnings, doing reformations, But there's also an element of the novum or the new in theology. The prophets can say God is about to do a new thing. Or as we look forward to the apocalypse, which we can usually identify with something really negative and destructive, but as the prophet said, beyond the darkness there's a bright new day. So also beyond death is resurrection, and beyond destruction is the future for which the human spirit hopes. If the death and resurrection of Jesus can become a microcosm of the macrocosm, we can expect the cross in history, or at least in that ambiguous history, and the utopia is something that we hope for eschatologically. Is it possible to marry transhumanism and Christian thinking? Let me just say, I ran into someone who believes this. His name's Jim Ledford at Arizona State University. I don't quite understand the scheme, but he very much would like a merger of his evangelical faith and the transhumanist vision. Finally, I forgot to recall. H+, that's the symbol or icon for transhumanism. I think it needs more realism. I'll Reinhold Niebuhr, Langdon Gilkey, to understand that no matter how many advances we make in genetics, nanotechnology, brain research, or what have you, we're still going to have the ambiguities that we currently experience. No amount of increased technology or intelligence will liberate us from sin. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that religious people have to be troglodytes, always carrying us back to the past. The Bible does promise a transformation. This fosters an ethic that promotes a change in light of the future well-being. Bye-bye. Thank you for your attention.
I'd like to explore your distinction between the archonic and the epigenetic in light of your very extensive work on the theology and ethics of stem cell therapy.
Yeah.
So the stem cell, pluripotent stem cells, on the one hand, seem to be an instance of the epigenetic, that they represent our biological openness to the future at the cellular level.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the capacity to be open in that respect is traceable at least to the origin of multicellular life. So in that sense, seems archonic.
It traces back to
the emergence of multicellular life.
Okay. Yeah.
And so in that sense, would seem archonic within your distinction. Mm-hmm. How should I place stem cells within your distinction?
The question, the very nature of pluripotent stem cells, should they be understood archonically or epigenetically? Well, I would say, first of all, they'd be archonic, but not in the sense of where they belong in evolutionary history, but where they belong in the development of either a person or a therapy. To me, the epigenesis would be the way you and I use the pluripotent stem cells, which is an ethical issue. Or if you take a look at biological evolution over a period of time, they may evolve into higher forms of order that we can't predict. And that would make them epigenetic. I think of epigenetic kind of the way holists like to think of the development of new stages of emergence where a new whole emerges and becomes more than the sum of the parts that went into it. That would be natural epigenesis. But just a pluripotent stem cell in a petri dish, I don't think it would be either one or the other. Unless I'm misunderstanding your question.
No, that's very helpful.
Yeah. Okay, Phil.
Well, thank you for a breathless trip. Which expect from you. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on one thing. There towards the end, where you talk about the Bible promises a transformation, and you closed that slide with the term well-being.
Right.
What, in your estimate, what is your idea of the well-being towards which human beings will be transformed?
I'm trying to remember, but Pope John Paul II actually came out with a definition of this for the World Health Organization. I can't remember the details, but of course you would include physical health and emotional strength and a sense of spiritual unity in the wider community, which would be both human as well as all of nature. I intellectually would want to take my rational answer to your question and root it in the symbol. So when we get to Isaiah's promise of the peaceable kingdom, for example, where the lion lies down with the lamb and the little child navigates amongst all the wild animals, I would want to say that's symbolic language for the healing of all things. And it's your and my place in God's world that would be realized in the fullest extent. In this life, we have fragments of it, but I think eschatologically it would be unambiguously healed in that respect. Let me just say...
There will be lions and lambs to lie down. John Polkinghorne says not all lions and lambs will be there, but God will select a certain population of lions and lambs. So they would be lying down together.
When Luther was asked whether he believes in Isaiah's image of the lion lying down with the lamb, Luther said, well, of course I do, it's in the Bible. But you would have to put in a new lamb each day. So we have to debate whether the essence of lionness, the essence of being a lion, includes the destruction of lambs or not. And if you turn a lion into a wimp eating straw, it's hardly a trophy for the kingdom of God, to be sure, because we think of the viciousness of the lion as part of the lion's nature. Let me just say that doesn't bother me. And why Polkinghorne, congratulations to him, he's a very rational person, but somehow or other, I can't move from the symbol of the peaceable kingdom to discrimination between these lions get in and those don't. Maybe you can help me understand his criteria, but I can't figure that one out.
I certainly can.
I think the issue is naturalism and supernaturalism here. Whether given the argument, whether theological naturalism emerges, I mean, this is where it ends up. It doesn't have the capacity.
So are you talking about this eschatological discussion or the transhumanists?
The transhumanists.
And the transhumanists are clearly naturalists, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this place has a history of theological
Yes, it does.
naturalism.
Yeah, it does.
Over against, let's just say neo-orthodoxy,
Right.
as a convenient way of
Yeah.
making the point. I guess the question is to check what you see as the danger of this kind of scientific advance squared.
Right.
Are you necessarily committed to a supernaturalism?
In order to check the dangers of a naturalistic transhumanism, does one have to be a supernaturalist?
Yeah.
Is that the question? Well, first of all, this is a naturalist school of thought. Just as an aside, when Bernard Loomer left the University of Chicago, he went to the GTU where I am, and he started his own little Chicago West with naturalism. So that was kind of nice when I arrived there, but then after a half decade or so, it kind of died out. So I'm somewhat familiar with his Whiteheadian form of naturalism, which among the naturalisms is kind of an open one. It doesn't really tie itself to a closed causal nexus in quite the way that a Newtonian worldview would have done. That's just a footnote. To be a critic of naturalistic post-humanism or transhumanism, would I need to appeal to a transcendent or a supernatural criterion? I don't think so. I think someone who just reads history and sees what human nature has been over our recorded history could forecast, something's going to go wrong at one point. You could just do that by way of extrapolation. So I don't think I would have to have appeal to something supernatural in order to offer an internal criticism. However, I do think that coming out of Christian theology or biblical theology, it is good and right that we hope for a better future. I think that's a God-inspired thing, to hope for a better future. And in some ways, I hope the transhumanists give us a better future. I hope that some of their technology actually succeeds. It's just that I am pessimistic that they're going to achieve a utopia with this, but could they make our lives better? Could we be healthier? Could we live longer? Could we achieve some things through this technology that we can't do right now? And I would say if they give it to us, great. I'll be grateful. But I don't think they're going to overcome the fall of man, as I think it was Simon Young had said. Does that speak to your question? Somewhat, yeah. Now, the Neo-Orthodox don't think of themselves as supernaturalistic, but they do have a doctrine of the transcendent, to be sure. And I presume your question would apply to both.
Yeah, I suppose you could argue that the principle of self-transcendence has built within it the capacity for criticism and corrective and correction. Is that fair? But I think there is a strain of this as well, that pursuing the naturalistic doesn't provide you the ground, the capacity to be fully critical.
So if you're limited strictly to the parameters of naturalism, you can't really be fully self-critical as you pursue these things.
Well,
is that what I heard you say?
That's the drift of your argument, it seems.
Oh, yeah, it is a gist of my argument, right.
I say that as a naturalist.
Pardon?
And I say that as a complete theological naturalist.
Yeah. Okay.
In your two categories of the archonic and the epigenetic, Christ-likeness was in the epigenetic.
It was epigenetic, correct.
And you went on further to say more about this sort of aspiration, not just to be merely human, but to be like Christ in the sense of, it seemed like a moral exemplar. And you noted the reasons why we might be skeptical that we're going to become more moral through these sorts of technologies. I wonder if you could say a little more theologically about the place of the cross. I mean,
Right.
The aim is to be Christ-like, and if the paradigmatic expression of Christ-likeness is being hung on the cross and dying willfully at a young age in the fullness of health,
Right.
what would that mean?
Well, when I talked about Christ-likeness as epigenetic, I had in mind kind of what a Wesleyan Methodist might think pursuing Christian perfection. That if I discipline myself day after day, year after year, at some point, I will become disposed only to love others all day long. I might make mistakes now and then, but my heart will be given totally to loving others. And that's the achievement over a period of time. We have various versions of sanctification and theosis, but that was the model that I had in mind. So Christ-likeness is a future accomplishment. Now, I'm a Lutheran, and Lutherans tend to be pretty pessimistic about that. Luther says, well, every day, die again, and get up tomorrow and get resurrected. I had a Lutheran colleague who walked around with a sweatshirt that said, I don't believe in sanctification. So at any rate, I had to play the role of a Methodist here in order to make that point. What do you think?
Well, it just strikes me that if that suffering to death was the fullest expression of love, which is, it seems to me, in the Christian tradition, more the aim than keeping the rules and, that all of the controlling of the appetites, etc., is toward the end of that self-emptying love of God and neighbor, that the cross stands a powerful icon or a powerful statement that trying to live a long time, trying to have enormous human capacities, physically, etc., seems a strange, seems incongruous with trying to become
Right. No, I would agree that a theology of the cross would deliver that kind of message. And you're right, I'm suggesting I'm working with an Abelardian and a Wesley kind of understanding of becoming more and more Christ-like, more and more loving over time. And that was my illustration for Genesis. No, I hadn't really thought about an alternative soteriology there, as you're suggesting with that theology of the cross. But even though I'm a Lutheran, I don't like to be a sad one. I do like to think that our life really could be better, and not just through science and technology, but through moral action. Our life really could be better, even if it's a this-worldly betterment. It's still worth pursuing. So I wouldn't want the theology of the cross to blunt that. Anyway, very good line of thinking.
Please join me in thanking our speaker. I saw at least one hand, and I hope that after we're finished, you'll get a chance to get your question in. In the back of this room are two plaques that are the Alumnus of the Year lecturer. And there is a piece of real estate with your name on it that's about this big. But this is something for you to take home. This is our way to mark your distinction as the Alumnus of the Year. I'm going to read the citation and then show it to everyone. It says, for his prolific imagination and influential scholarship as writer and editor, that has modeled a highly productive two-way dialogue between theology and science on such central and difficult issues as stem cells, the Human Genome Project, and the environment, semicolon. For his more than 30 years of inspirational teaching of ministry and doctoral students at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and the Graduate Theological Union. For his inquiring mind and embrace of multiple conversation partners and publics within the Academy and the world, the Baptist Theological Union names Ted Peters Alumnus of the Year 2011, speech given in 2010 of the University of Chicago Divinity School, 28 October 2010. Conversation downstairs in the common room, am I correct, Mary Jean? With a reception, please join us there. And thank you for your attendance.
top of it.